First up, I'm a big fan of the Rebel 500, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the CMX1100 in the flesh. But there is one thing that is causing me concern. Let's have a chat. I was very pleased and surprised by the announcement of the new CMX1100. After seeing the new NC750X and XADV disappear from Honda Australia's website, I was genuinely concerned we might not see the CMX1100 down under. But my fears were put to rest when I saw the CMX1100 Coming Soon banner gracing the homepage of the Honda Australia website. Now, I have to admit, the idea of squeezing the Africa Twin engine into the Rebel platform is quite appealing and very unexpected. Honda have a long history with cruisers in the US market. When we look at the Shadow and the Valkyrie and bikes of that like, and I'm wondering if we're starting to see a re-emergence of cruisers from Honda. Looking at the CMX1100 or Rebel 1100, I find it to be a very appealing bike, and I really like the way it looks, especially from this three-quarter view, especially when you start to add accessories to it like the front cowling as shown here. Let's have a look at some of the standout features of the new CMX1100. The first thing that springs to mind is the inclusion of the 6-speed DCT automatic gearbox. Now, I've never ridden a DCT Honda, but I have no aversion to giving the DCT gearbox a try, and I wouldn't mind it on a motorcycle at all, in fact. So seeing the DCT gearbox included here as an option is great, and another good thing is the DCT version will be available in Australia, unlike the NC750X where we only got the manual version. Another very interesting feature is the camshaft timing. What Honda have done here is very clever. They've set a different cam profile for each cylinder. So one cylinder will produce more power above 4000 RPM and the other cylinder will produce more power below 4000 RPM. So along with the 270-degree crankshaft, the engine should provide for a unique power characteristic. Now, when it comes to performance, to get some sort of gauge as to what this bike will feel like to ride power-wise, I'm going to compare it to my own NC750X. Now, why would I compare this bike to the NC750X, you might ask? Well, the NC750X and the new Rebel 1100 are both going to weigh 220 kilograms, or 485 pounds. So both bikes will weigh the same, and both bikes will produce their maximum torque at the same RPM. And both bikes are parallel twins. So we have two parallel twins from Honda producing the same amount of torque at the same RPM, weighing the same. So the power and torque figures quoted in the specifications will give me a good indication of what it's like to ride the CMX1100 compared to my own NC750X. Now, the power in the NC750X for me, I find completely adequate and satisfactory. I've never had a point where I felt I wish I had more power, and I particularly like the way the motorcycle drives out of the corners. I don't have to wring its neck, I just have to give a bit of acceleration and it will just drive out of the corners beautifully. Now, the way the power is going to be delivered on the CMX1100 will also be very similar. It's a parallel twin, 270 degree, producing its maximum torque at 4,750 RPM. Let's compare those specifications. The Rebel 1100 or CMX1100 will produce 64 kilowatts of power at 7,000 RPM. That's roughly about 85 horsepower. And my NC750X produces 40 kilowatts of power at 6,250 RPM, or around about 55 horsepower. That's a big step up, going from 55 horsepower to 85 horsepower. That's 30 horsepower more, and that's on a bike that'll weigh the same. Now, its maximum power is produced earlier on the NC750X at 6,250 RPM versus 7,000 RPM on the CMX1100, but that's not a lot of difference. So they should feel very much the same in the way they deliver the power, but the CMX1100 will have almost 1.5 times more power, so that's going to be significantly noticeable. Now, looking at the torque, we can see the CMX1100 has 98 Newton meters, which is about 70 foot-pound, and the NC750X has 68 Newton meters, which works out at about 50 foot-pound. So there again, 1.5 times more torque on the CMX1100 on a bike that weighs the same. And it's really interesting that both of the parallel twins, the 1100 and the 750, are both producing their maximum torque at 4,750 RPM. So they're going to feel identical to drive in the way they drive out of a corner and the way they deliver their torque and their power. And as I said before, the NC750X delivers its torque and power beautifully and it's just so effortless to drive out of the corners. So this is going to be a very, very fun bike to ride. So heading back to the unique features of the new CMX1100. Another thing we need to talk about is the cruise control. I wish all bikes in 2021 would come standard with cruise control. Even if it's just a one-button affair like some of the Triumphs have fitted. It's just so convenient, and especially on a long trip, to be able to give your right hand a rest. It's just so convenient and I think necessary in all bikes. So what I've done, the NC750X I have now doesn't come standard with cruise control, nor can it be fitted. But I've installed an Atlas throttle lock on my NC750X, and it's not ideal, but it's working really well for the use I've had of it so far. So seeing cruise control fitted standard to the CMX1100 is really good to see, and a big selling feature for me. Now the other thing that the CMX1100 comes with is rider modes for power, torque, and engine braking. So for the modes for power, you'll have standard, rain, sport, and a fourth one that's just for user programmable settings. The CMX1100 also features a radially mounted front brake caliper to give increased brake feel and control. And although it only features a single disc, it's a large 330mm disc on the front end. My NC750X also has a large single rotor on the front, and I find the braking on that to be perfectly adequate, and I've never thought it needs an extra disc. Now I really like the instrument design. I think it's nice and clean. All the information you need is readily readable. You've got your tacho, you've got your speed, you've got your gear position indicator, fuel gauge, temperature gauge, and then the three modes are visible: power, torque, and engine braking, and then you've got your odometer. Now we've discussed the weight, 220 kilograms, which equates to 485 pounds. And for me personally, as I've said in previous videos, 220 kilograms, I have heard people say that's heavy for a motorcycle, but for me, I don't find that to be the case at all, especially when the motorcycle is carrying its weight down low, as the NC750X does and as the CMX1100 does. So I'm expecting this bike to be a very easy bike to manage. And the CMX1100 also comes with 3 litres of under-seat storage and a USB-C port for charging devices. The CMX1100 also comes with full LED lighting, and Honda are claiming high quality suspension front and rear, so the test will be in the ride quality. The shocks do look like there's not a lot of travel on the rear, so we may see cruiser-esque style performance from the rear shocks, or maybe Honda have worked some magic, but it is a piggyback shock, so I think we'll have to see what it's like in the actual riding. Looking further into the specs, we can see it's a 1084cc 8-valve parallel twin engine with a 270-degree crank. The tyres are a 130mm 18-inch on the front and a 180mm 16-inch on the rear. So 130mm on the front is just over 5 inches, and the 180mm tyre on the rear is just over 7 inches in width. So this should provide for pretty standard handling and turning characteristics. Other notable mentions are the 13.6 litre fuel tank, that's about 3.5 US gallons, and the fuel economy is 4.9 litres per 100 Ks, and that's roughly about 47 miles to the gallon. So interestingly enough, those fuel consumption figures are pretty well identical to the new 2021 Harley-Davidson Street Bob. So we have an 1100cc engine from Honda consuming the same amount of fuel as an 1800cc twin from Harley-Davidson. So that's pretty interesting because normally Hondas are very fuel efficient. So this is telling me that Honda's focus for the parallel twin is performance, which I find very interesting. Now let's take a look at the accessories that will be available for the CMX1100 at launch. the start of the video, I did mention that I had one concern about the new CMX1100, and that concern is ergonomics. Looking at the images of the CMX1100, the seat-to-peg ratio gives the impression there may not be a lot of room for taller riders. So as per usual, I've created a mock-up of how my 6-foot 1-inch frame will fit on the Honda CMX1100. So seeing my 6-foot 1-inch frame on this bike, it does give the impression that it's going to have more room than I was expecting, and may actually be quite comfortable to ride. Now, foot position wise, I was worried I might be too cramped, but this looks quite fine for me. I think this would be quite good. I did experiment and see what it would look like if the bike had forward controls, or if they could be fitted, but looking at this, I'm not going to gain much by doing that. I don't think there's any point in trying to fit forward controls on this motorcycle. So ergonomically, I think that riding position is quite doable. And after having seen this, I'm quite excited to really investigate the bike further and try and get a test ride once they're available in Australia. Okay, I think I've covered everything I wanted to cover in this video. So summing up, for me the CMX1100 is a very attractive motorcycle, and it's a bike I could see myself owning. And I think it's also letting us know that Honda are again ready to start dipping their toes into the cruiser market. And I think they'll be watching to see what the success of this motorcycle is before taking any more steps. But I'm predicting this will be a very popular bike, given that it's around 220 kilos in weight. It has an 1100cc parallel twin engine with a 270-degree crank. I also really like how they've tuned the cam profiles to have a profile for each cylinder. One cylinder is basically for horsepower and the other is basically for torque. So I think it's going to be a very fun bike to ride, and I'm really keen to start seeing it on the roads. So if you've made it this far, thanks very much for watching this video, and hopefully I'll see you again in the next one. Bye for now.